Welcome to the deep dive. We sift through stacks of sources to pull out the insights you need, maybe even a few surprises. Today, we're getting into something really fundamental. It shapes pretty much our entire digital world. Language isn't just spoken words, it's also this deep structure, right? It lets us talk to computers, define math, structure, well, everything. So, what if you could actually formalize the rules of language, make them precise? That's what we're doing today. We're diving into formal grammars, and we're really going to focus on something called context-free grammars. Why? Because they're, well, foundational to computing, especially in automata theory. Our info comes from a solid set of lecture notes covering the whole spectrum, from general grammars right down to the nitty-gritty of context-free ones. Okay, so let's start there. When we say grammar here, we're not talking about sentence diagrams or comma rules, are we? What does grammar mean in, this computational context?
No, definitely not English class grammar, though the idea is related. In this world, a grammar is basically a linguistic formalism that generates strings of a language. Think of it as a system, right? A system built on rewrite rules or production rules. You start with a specific symbol, and you just keep applying these rules. You replace parts of your current string based on the rules again and again until everything left is what we call terminals.
Terminals, like
Yeah.
the final letters or numbers?
Exactly. The basic building blocks, the alphabet of the language you're defining. So formally, a grammar G is this collection of four things, a four-tuple, VTPS.
Okay, break that down. VTPS.
Right. So V is your set of variables or non-terminals. These are like placeholder structural guides. T is the set of terminal symbols, your actual alphabet, like A, B, 0, 1, whatever. P is the set of production rules, the heart of it. They look like Ice. Ice has to have at least one variable in it, and A can be any mix of variables and terminals. S is the start symbol. It's always a variable from V, and it's where every single derivation begins. You have to be able to get from S to any valid string in the language.
Got it. So to make this feel a bit more real for everyone listening, the notes mention generating decimal numbers like 1,000,000. How would rules actually build something like that with the commas and everything?
Yeah, that's a great example because it shows complexity from simple rules. You might have, say, N1 year 1.9 for just one digit.
Yeah.
Simple enough.
Right.
Then maybe N2 year N1 for two digits, and 3 year N1 for three. Then you could combine them. N1 3 year N1 N2 N3. That handles the part before the first comma, usually.
Right, like the 1 in 1,000,000.
Exactly. Now, the clever part is the recursion for the comma groups. A rule like L year N3, L. See what that does?
L is either 3 digits or it's 3 digits, a comma, and another L.
Precisely. So it can chain those three-digit groups together. Then a final rule might be N13.
Right.
That covers numbers with and without commas.
Wow. Okay, so to get 1,000,000, you'd start with N. Pick N, N13, L, then maybe make N13 become N1, which becomes 1. Then you expand L using N3L twice.
Yeah, expanding those N3s into 1,003 each time until you've replaced all the variables. That whole step-by-step replacement process, that's derivation.
Okay.
When we write S, that means you get SAG from away by applying one rule to one step. Like if you have SE, ASB, and the string ASB, one step gives ASB. We say ASB directly derives ASB. And if we write a 1, that little star means you get from SEU in 0 or more steps. Could be one step, could be many, could be none if they're the same string.
So the language itself is just all the strings made only of terminals, like 1,000,000 or S that you can possibly reach starting from S.
That's exactly it. SN, where W is a string in your terminal alphabet T.
Let's look at a couple of those classic simple examples from the notes. There's one SASB, that is the empty string, right? How does that tiny grammar work?
It's surprisingly powerful. It generates strings like AAB, basically any number of A's followed by the same number of B's. The SASB part adds an A at the front and a B at the back, keeping them balanced.
And the tab.
That's the stop button. It replaces S with nothing, ending the derivation. Without it, you generate pairs forever. Another great one is SSS. What does that look like?
S puts parentheses around whatever S makes.
Yeah.
SS puts two S-generated things side by side. SS is empty. That feels like balanced parentheses.
You got it. It perfectly captures that nested structure. You see rules like this implicitly defining valid code blocks or math formulas all the time.
Right, and this leads nicely into the idea that not all grammars have the same power, I guess. The notes talk about the Chomsky hierarchy. Sounds important.
Oh, it's fundamental.
Yeah.
Proposed by Noam Chomsky, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It classifies grammars into 4 types based on how restricted their production rules are. And these restrictions directly relate to their generative power, what kinds of languages they can describe.
And crucially, what kind of machines can recognize those languages?
Exactly. So at the top, most generally, you have type 0, unrestricted grammars. Rules are very loose. Aw sakes. These are beasts. They correspond to Turing machines, the theoretical limit of computation.
Okay, the everything machines.
Pretty much. Then type 1, context sensitive. The rule ONSEC has a key restriction. The right side of ZEC can't be shorter than the left side, so you can't erase symbols, basically. And the replacement of A depends on its context, the OSAC around it. These match up with linear-bound automata, which are like Turing machines, but limited in the amount of tape they can use.
Getting more constrained.
Yep. Then jump down to type 3, regular grammars. Very strict rules, either right linear like AAB or left linear like ABA or A. Basically, you generate the string one symbol at a time from one end.
And these match.
Finite automata. Simple machines with no memory other than their current state. The lecture notes mention a striking similarity here. How a right linear grammar builds a string symbol by symbol from the left is almost exactly how a finite automaton reads a string symbol by symbol. Perfect match.
Okay, so type 0, 1, 3. That leaves type 2, context-free grammars, CFGs. These seem to be the stars of the show for practical computing. Why are they so central?
They hit a sweet spot. CFG rules always have the simple form A. Just a single variable A on the left, A on the right can be anything. The context-free part is key. You can replace A with A anywhere A appears, regardless of what's next to it. No context needed.
Much simpler than type 1 then.
Way simpler to work with computationally. And their machine equivalent, push-down automata, PDAs. Think of a finite automaton, but give it a stack like a stack of plates.
A stack for memory.
Exactly. That stack lets it handle nesting. When you process something like A plus B, C, you need to remember you saw the first void, then process the inner part, then remember to look for the closing. The stack is perfect for that kind of temporary memory. That's why CFGs and PDAs are so good for programming languages. You know, it's interesting, the original goal, Chomsky's goal, was maybe to use these to formalize natural languages, human languages.
How did that work out?
Still largely elusive, as the notes say. Natural language is just too messy, too ambiguous. Chomsky's famous example, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Grammatically perfect, according to a simple CFG, but totally meaningless.
Right, doesn't make any sense.
But where CFGs absolutely revolutionized things was in defining the syntax of programming languages. They became the universally accepted formalism. Why? Because code is all about nested structures, loops inside functions, expressions inside statements. CFGs handle that nesting beautifully. They literally underlie the theory and practice of writing compilers. That's the big aha moment.
So the grammar is the rulebook the compiler uses to check if my code structure is even valid before it tries to run it, like for, say, 123 plus BC.
Precisely. You'd have CFG rules like expr plus expr or expr x, and other rules like expr integer or expr identifier, then rules for integer and identifier. The compiler uses these rules to build a structure, figuring out that happens before plus A based on how the rules are written. It's not just reading characters, it's understanding the structure.
Okay, that makes sense. But we've talked about derivations as sequences of steps. How do we actually, see that structure the compiler is building?
Good question. That's where derivation trees, or sometimes called parse trees, are incredibly useful. They give you a visual representation of how a string was generated according to the grammar's rules.
Like a family tree for the string.
Kind of, yeah. It's a rooted tree. The root node is usually the start symbol, S.
Mm-hmm.
Every node inside the tree, not a leaf, is labeled with a variable. Its children, read from left to right, correspond exactly to the right-hand side of a production rule used for that variable.
So if node A has children XYZ, then there must be a rule A, XYZ.
Exactly. And the leaves of the tree are either terminal symbols or that empty string symbol, OVO. If a leaf is OSO, it's always the only child of its parent. And the big reason we use them, their main motivation, is they show that different sequences of applying rules can lead to the same structure. Remember the A, B, C, B, B, C, C, C example. You could derive BC by replacing B first, or C first, different steps.
But the tree looks the same, A at the top, with B and C below it, and B below B, C below C.
Exactly the same tree. So one derivation sequence gives one tree, but multiple derivation sequences might map to the same tree. The tree captures the essential structure, regardless of the exact order you apply the rules, and the yield of the tree. You just read the leaves from left to right, skipping any O's. That gives you the final string. There's a key theorem. A string W is in the language EG, if and only if there's a derivation tree in grammar G whose yield is W. It connects the derivation process directly to this visual structure.
Okay, the tree shows the structure. That's clear. But then, why do the notes also talk about leftmost and rightmost derivations, where you always have to replace the leftmost variable or always the rightmost one? If the tree captures the result, why add that constraint?
That's a really good point. The tree shows the final structure, yes, but it does not necessarily capture the order the derivation rules were applied. And sometimes, especially when you're building parsers for compilers, having a single predictable order is really helpful.
Like a standard way of doing things.
Exactly. And here's the cool part. For any given parse tree in a context-free grammar, there is exactly one leftmost derivation that produces it and exactly one rightmost derivation. So even if there are many ways to derive a string freestyle, these leftmost and rightmost approaches give you a unique canonical derivation sequence for each distinct parse tree. It simplifies analysis and algorithm design.
Okay, that makes sense for consistency. But what if a string doesn't just have multiple derivations leading to the same tree? What if it can have more than one different parse tree? Or multiple leftmost derivations? That sounds like a recipe for confusion.
It is. Big time. That's precisely what we call an ambiguous grammar.
Mm-hmm.
A grammar is ambiguous if some string in its language has more than one leftmost derivation, or equivalently more than one rightmost derivation. And perhaps the easiest way to think about it, it means that string has more than one derivation tree.
So the structure itself isn't unique for that string.
Right. It's not just different ways of getting there. It's different possible structures, different interpretations. And while ambiguity might add richness to human language, the notes are clear. It's problematic for natural languages, but catastrophic for programming languages.
Catastrophic. Why so strong?
Well, imagine your compiler sees 1 plus 2, 3. If the grammar allows two different trees, one grouping 1 plus 2, 3 and another 1 plus 2, 3, how does it know which one you meant? The results are completely different. 9 versus 7. That leads to unpredictable bugs.
Yikes. Okay. Any simple examples?
Sure. Even a tiny grammar like SAAA with AA, the string A can be derived two ways, SAA one tree, or a different tree with an extra step. That grammar is ambiguous. The classic one is the arithmetic grammar XAX plus XXXN for 1 plus 23. It lets you build trees corresponding to both interpretations. And in actual programming, the famous dangling else problem, if you write if C1 then if C2 then S1 else S2, does the else S2 attach to the inner of C2 or the outer of C1? An ambiguous grammar might allow both parses. Bad news.
Ah, definitely bad news. So can we just fix ambiguous grammars, rewrite them so they all...
Question. Sometimes, yes. You can often rewrite a grammar to eliminate ambiguity. For arithmetic, you introduce different variables for terms and factors to enforce precedence, making sure multiplication happens before addition, essentially placing operators with higher precedence appear lower in the grammar structure.
You can also build in associativity rules.
But not always. Not always. And this is a critical point. Some languages are provably inherently ambiguous. No matter how you write the grammar for that language, it will be ambiguous. So ambiguity is a property of the grammar you write, but sometimes it's also an unavoidable property of the language itself.
Wow.
And the real kicker, there exists no algorithm in general to decide whether a given CFG is ambiguous. It's undecidable. You can't just feed a grammar into a program and have it tell you for sure if it's ambiguous or not.
So you just have to be careful and
Yeah.
maybe use heuristics.
Exactly. There are heuristics.
Mm-hmm.
Like if a grammar has a symbol that's used in both a left recursive way and a right recursive way, a la 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 la, that's often a red flag for ambiguity, but it's not foolproof.
Okay, so ambiguity is tough. Given that, and just generally wanting things to be simpler, are there ways to kind of standardize CFGs, put them into a predictable format?
Yes, absolutely. That's the whole idea behind normal forms. A normal form for a CFG restricts the format of its production rules, but critically, without reducing its generative power. It can still generate the exact same language, but the rules look simpler and more uniform.
And why bother?
They're incredibly useful for proving properties of grammars and designing algorithms. If you know every grammar you're dealing with follows a strict pattern, writing an algorithm to process it becomes much, much easier. The most famous one is probably Chomsky normal form, or CNF.
Chomsky again. What does CNF look like?
It's beautifully simple. Every single production rule must be in one of just two forms, either A, B, C, where A, B, and C are variables, or A, where A is a variable and A is a single terminal symbol.
That's it. A variable goes to two variables or a variable goes to one terminal.
That's pretty much it. The only small exception is if the language includes the empty string. In that case, you're allowed to have the rule S error, where S is the start symbol, but then S cannot appear on the right-hand side of any other rule.
And can you turn any CFG into the CNF?
Yes, any CFG that doesn't generate the empty string can be converted, and even those that do generate O can be converted with that special SO rule handled separately. The process involves a few steps, basically cleaning up the grammar first.
Like what?
First, you eliminate all rules. Rules like AIR, carefully adjusting other rules so you don't change the language. Then you eliminate all unit rules. Rules like A, B, where one variable just becomes another. Finally, you take all the remaining rules and convert them into the proper normal form, breaking down any right-hand sides that are too long or mixed variables and terminals, often by introducing new intermediate variables.
So it's a systematic way to get to that clean AEBC or AO format.
Exactly. It makes the grammar much tidier and easier for algorithms, especially certain parsing algorithms used in compilers, to handle.
Wow, okay. We've covered a lot of ground. We started with just the idea of grammar as a formal recipe for generating strings, like an EBN, or even those comma-separated numbers. Then we saw how CFGs fit into the bigger Chomsky hierarchy, and why their context-free nature and connection to push-down automata make them perfect for defining programming language syntax, the backbone of compilers. Then we looked at parse trees as a way to visualize the structure, understanding why most derivations give us that canonical view. And finally, we tackled the big challenge of ambiguity, why multiple trees are disastrous for code, and how normal forms like CNF try to impose some order, even though finding ambiguity itself is, well, fundamentally hard. So, here's something to chew on as we wrap up. We've seen how precisely these formal grammars can define computer languages, leaving no room for error. But human languages, they thrive on nuance, context, and yes, ambiguity. Thinking about that, how might these formal grammar concepts help us better understand the structure of human language, even with its messiness? And maybe more pointedly, what does the inherent ambiguity of some languages mean for AI? Can an AI ever truly understand us, grasp the intended meaning behind potentially ambiguous phrases the way another human hopefully does? Something to ponder on your own deep dive.